The telephone's shrill ring cut through the peaceful morning silence of Marcus Blackwood's study like a blade through silk. The distinguished private detective set down his cup of Earl Grey and reached for the receiver, his weathered hands steady despite the early hour. Blackwood speaking. "Detective Blackwood, thank God you're there." The voice on the other end was strained, breathless. "This is Inspector Carter, NYPD. I need your expertise on something ... unusual." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his steel gray eyes focusing intently. In his 23 years as a private investigator, he had learned that when seasoned police officers used the word unusual, it typically meant something far more sinister was at play. "What's the nature of the case, Inspector?" "A death at Ashwood Manor, upstate New York. The victim is Victoria Ashwood, 72, heiress to the Ashwood textile fortune. Found dead in her locked study this morning by the housekeeper. The local coroner is calling it natural causes. Quote." Carter's voice trailed off uncertainly. "But you suspect otherwise?" "The scene doesn't sit right with me, Blackwood. Too many inconsistencies. Too many people who stood to gain from her death all gathered under one roof. And there's something else, something that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it." Marcus leaned forward in his leather chair, intrigued. "Go on." She was found with a chess piece clutched in her hand. "A black king. But here's the thing, there's no chess set anywhere in the house. Nobody can explain where it came from or why she'd be holding it." The detective's pulse quickened slightly. In his experience, seemingly insignificant details often held the keys to the most complex mysteries. "When did this occur?" "Sometime between midnight and 6 this morning. The manor's been sealed off, and all the house guests are still here." "Can you come?" "I have a feeling this is going to be more complicated than anyone realizes." Marcus glanced at his assistant, Eleanor Hayes, who had just entered the study carrying a fresh pot of tea. Her keen blue eyes immediately picked up on the tension in his voice. "We'll be there within the hour, Inspector. Don't let anyone leave the premises." As he hung up the phone, Eleanor set down the tray and looked at him expectantly. "Another case?" "Indeed, and potentially one of the most intriguing we've encountered." Marcus stood and reached for his coat. "Pack your investigation kit, Eleanor. We're going to Ashwood Manor." The drive to the manor took them through the winding roads of upstate New York, past autumn-colored forests that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. Eleanor drove while Marcus studied the initial police report that Carter had faxed over. Quite the cast of characters, Eleanor observed, navigating a sharp turn. "From what I can see in that report, the victim wasn't exactly beloved by her family." Marcus nodded grimly. "Victoria Ashwood was known for her, shall we say, difficult personality. Controlling, manipulative, and extremely wealthy. A dangerous combination. Who inherits?" "That's where it gets interesting." Marcus flipped through the pages. "According to her attorney, she recently changed her will. The reading is scheduled for tomorrow, but nobody knows the contents except the lawyer himself." Eleanor's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "So everyone in that house tonight has a motive." "Precisely. And one of them may have decided not to wait for the reading." As they crested a hill, Ashwood Manor came into view. The imposing Victorian structure loomed against the gray sky like something from a Gothic novel. Its towering spires and elaborate stonework spoke of old money and older secrets. "Inspector." Carter met them at the front entrance. He was a compact man in his mid-30s, with sharp features and the kind of alert eyes that missed nothing. His handshake was firm, but Marcus could feel the tension radiating from him. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Carter said. "I know this might seem like overkill for what appears to be a natural death, but my instincts are screaming that something's wrong here." "Trust your instincts," Marcus advised. "They've likely served you well thus far. Now, tell me about the scene." Carter led them through the grand foyer, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Oil paintings of stern-faced Ashwood ancestors gazed down at them from gilded frames, as if judging their intrusion into family affairs. The body was discovered at 6:30 this morning by Mrs. Patricia Henley, the housekeeper. She came to bring Victoria her morning tea, as was their routine. Found the study door locked from the inside. How did she gain entry? Used her master key. When she opened the door, she found Victoria slumped over her desk. At first glance, it looked like she'd had a heart attack while working on some papers. They paused outside a heavy oak door marked with police tape. Through the gap, Marcus could see into the study, a book-lined sanctuary of dark wood and leather furniture. But, Eleanor prompted, Carter's expression darkened. But when the coroner arrived, he found that chess piece I mentioned, a black king carved from ebony. She was gripping it so tightly that we had to pry her fingers open. Marcus studied the scene through the doorway. Everything appeared normal to normal, perhaps. You said there's no chess set in the house? None that anyone can locate. I've had my officers search every room. The closest thing is a backgammon set in the library, but it's been dusty and undisturbed for years. Curious indeed. Marcus stepped carefully into the study, his trained eyes scanning every detail. Who else was in the house last night? Carter consulted his notebook. 5 house guests, plus Mrs. Henley and the cook, Agnes Mueller. The guests are Victoria's nephew, David Ashwood, and his wife, Margaret. Victoria's stepdaughter, Isabel Frost, from her late husband's first marriage. The family attorney, Jonathan Pierce. And somewhat surprisingly, Dr. Helena Marsh, Victoria's personal physician. Quite the gathering. Was this planned? According to the family, Victoria summoned them all here for an important announcement. Something about changes to her estate planning. Eleanor moved to examine the desk where the body had been found. What was she working on when she died? Letters, apparently, though most are routine correspondence with her financial advisors. Nothing that seems particularly relevant. Carter paused. There's one thing, though. We found a half-finished letter addressed to someone named R. Its cryptic mentions settling old debts and making amends for past mistakes. Marcus's pulse quickened. Do we know who R might be? None of the house guests have names starting with R. We're still investigating. The detective knelt beside the desk, careful not to disturb the scene. Something glinted near the wastebasket, a small piece of paper that had been crumpled and discarded. He pointed it out to Carter. Has this been examined? We photographed it, but left it in place. It appears to be a torn fragment of a photograph. Using his handkerchief, Marcus carefully lifted the paper scrap. It showed part of what might have been a face, though it was impossible to make out any features. More intriguingly, there appeared to be a date written on the back, 1987, 36 years ago, Eleanor murmured. Victoria would have been in her 30s then? The question is, Marcus said, standing, why would she be looking at old photographs on the night she died? And why tear one up? Carter led them from the study toward the main drawing room where the house guests were waiting. I should warn you, they're not exactly a harmonious group. There's been considerable tension since the news of Victoria's death broke. As they approached the drawing room, raised voices could be heard through the closed doors. Absolutely ridiculous to suggest that any of us would. Oh, please, David. We all know how desperately you needed money after that investment scandal. That's enough. A woman's voice cut through the argument. Arguing like children won't bring Aunt Victoria back. Marcus exchanged a meaningful glance with Eleanor. Grief, it seemed, was not the predominant emotion among the potential heirs. Carter opened the drawing room doors, and the conversation immediately ceased. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward them with varying degrees of suspicion and interest. Ladies and gentlemen, Carter announced, this is Detective Marcus Blackwood and his assistant, Eleanor Hayes. They'll be assisting with our investigation into Mrs. Ashwood's death. A tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair rose from his chair near the fireplace. Investigation? Inspector, surely you don't suspect foul play? My aunt died of natural causes, the coroner confirmed it. You must be David Ashwood, Marcus observed, noting the man's defensive posture and the nervous twitch in his left eye. I am. And I fail to see why a private detective is necessary. This is clearly a family matter. Murder often is, Marcus replied quietly. Asterisk, the word murder hit the room like a physical blow. An elegant woman in her 40s gasped audibly, while a younger woman with auburn hair went pale. Murder? The auburn-haired woman found her voice. But the coroner said, the coroner made a preliminary assessment, Carter interjected. We're conducting a more thorough investigation. Marcus studied each face in turn, cataloging reactions. David Ashwood looked angry and frightened. The woman who had gasped, presumably his wife Margaret, appeared genuinely shocked. The auburn-haired woman seemed more calculated in her surprise that an older gentleman, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward. I'm Jonathan Pierce, Mrs. Ashwood's attorney. While I understand your need to be thorough, I must object the inflammatory use of the term murder without concrete evidence. And what would constitute concrete evidence in your opinion, Mr. Pierce? Marcus asked. Well, signs of struggle, evidence of poison, a weapon, the usual indicators of foul play. What about a mysterious chess piece clutched in the victim's hand? Pierce's composure slipped slightly. I'm not sure what you mean, but Marcus was watching the other's reactions. The auburn-haired woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, while an older woman in medical attire, presumably Dr. Marsh, suddenly found something fascinating about her hands. Perhaps we should conduct individual interviews, Marcus suggested. Inspector Carter, might we use the library? As they prepared to leave the drawing room, Eleanor noticed something that made her pause. On a side table near the window sat a small silver frame, but it was empty, as if someone had recently removed a photograph. Excuse me, she said to the room in general. Was there a photograph in this frame? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, the auburn-haired woman spoke. There used to be a family photo from years ago. I noticed it was missing this morning. Missing? Marcus's interest sharpened. When was it last seen? Yesterday evening, during cocktails. I specifically remember commenting on it to Victoria. And what did Mrs. Ashwood say? The woman's eyes grew distant. She said some pictures were better forgotten. Marcus felt that familiar tingle that came when puzzle pieces began to align. A missing photograph, a torn fragment with a date from 1987, and a chess piece with no board. The game, as the saying went, was afoot. But as he looked around the room at the assembled suspects, each harboring their own secrets and motives, Marcus realized that this particular game might be more deadly than any he had encountered before. The first move had been played 36 years ago. Victoria Ashwood had just become the first casualty. The question now was, who would be next? Asterisk, the library at Ashwood Manor was a testament to generations of wealth and learning. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves housed thousands of leather-bound volumes, their spines gleaming in the afternoon light that filtered through tall, diamond-paned windows. Marcus had chosen this room deliberately. Its formal atmosphere often encouraged honesty, or at least more careful lies. Let's begin with you, Mr. Ashwood, Marcus said, settling into a wingback chair across from David. Eleanor positioned herself at a writing desk, notebook ready, while Inspector Carter stood near the window. Observing, David Ashwood shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the chair's armrest. I don't understand why we're going through this charade. My aunt died of natural causes. She was 72, had a weak heart. These things happen. When did you last see Mrs. Ashwood alive? Marcus asked, ignoring the protest. During dinner last night, around 8 o'clock. She seemed perfectly normal, though perhaps a bit more animated than usual. Animated how? David's eyes darted toward the window. She was discussing her plans for the estate. Said she had some adjustments to make. Some people who deserved more recognition for their loyalty. Did she specify who these people might be? No, but she kept glancing at Dr. Marsh throughout the conversation. Helena's been her physician for 15 years, you understand. Very devoted. Eleanor looked up from her notes. What time did dinner conclude? Around 9:30. Victoria excused herself early, said she had correspondence to attend to. The rest of us remained in the drawing room until nearly midnight. All of you? Carter interjected. Together the entire time? David hesitated. Well, no. Margaret retired around 10. She'd been having headaches. Isabel left shortly after, said she wanted to read. Jonathan and Helena continued discussing some medical matter until about 11:30. And then, Helena went to her room. Jonathan and I shared a nightcap in the study, not Victoria's private study, mind you, but the smaller one adjacent to the library. Marcus leaned forward. What did you discuss with Mr. Pierce? Family business, financial matters, the usual concerns when dealing with someone of Victoria's particular temperament. Meaning? David's composure cracked slightly. Meaning my aunt was vindictive, Detective Blackwood. She took pleasure in dangling inheritances over our heads like treats before hungry dogs. Yes, I needed money. My investment firm hit some rough patches last year. But that doesn't make me a killer. Tell me about 1987, Marcus said suddenly. The color drained from David's face so rapidly that Eleanor actually looked up in alarm. 1887? What do you mean? You tell me. What significance does that year hold for your family? I was barely 21 in 1987, just finished college. Why would that year matter? But his hands were trembling now, and sweat had appeared on his forehead despite the room's chill. Marcus filed away the reaction for later analysis. Where were you between midnight and 6 this morning? In bed asleep. Margaret can confirm it. I'm sure she can. Marcus stood. Thank you, Mr. Ashwood. Please send in your wife. Margaret Ashwood proved to be a more composed subject, though her grief appeared genuine. She was an elegant woman in her early 40s, with silver-streaked brown hair and intelligent hazel eyes that seemed constantly on the verge of tears. Victoria was difficult. I won't pretend otherwise, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But she wasn't evil. She'd had a hard life losing her first husband in that awful accident, then Harold dying so suddenly 5 years ago. Tell me about her relationship with Isabel Frost, Eleanor requested. Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Strained would be putting it kindly. Isabel never forgave Victoria for marrying her father. She always felt Victoria was a gold digger who manipulated Harold into changing his will. Was she? Victoria was many things, Miss Hayes, but she genuinely loved Harold. Their marriage wasn't a business arrangement, despite what Isabel believed. What about Dr. Marsh? Marcus asked. Your husband suggested Victoria might be planning to include her more prominently in the will. Helena's been wonderful to Victoria over the years. More like a daughter than a doctor, really? Victoria had no children of her own, you see. Helena filled that void, especially after Harold died. Carter stepped forward. Mrs. Ashwood, did you notice anything unusual about your aunt-in-law's behavior last night? Margaret considered the question carefully. She seemed excited about something, almost triumphant. During cocktails, she made several cryptic comments about justice finally being served and old wounds being healed. Do you know what she meant? No, but she was holding that silver picture frame, the empty one Eleanor asked about. She kept staring at it throughout the evening. Did you see what happened to the photograph that was in it? No, but I assumed Victoria removed it. She'd been going through old photo albums recently, reminiscing about the past. Marcus exchanged glances with Eleanor. Can you confirm your husband's whereabouts last night? Asterisk, of course. David was in bed beside me from around 11:45 until morning. I'm a light sleeper. I would have known if he'd left the room. Thank you. Mrs. Ashwood, please send in Miss Frost. Isabel. Frost entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to boardrooms and confrontation. At 38, she possessed the kind of sharp beauty that spoke of excellent genes and expensive maintenance. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, and her dark eyes held no trace of grief. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, shall we? She said, settling into the chair without invitation. Yes, I despise my stepmother. Yes, I benefit from her death. And yes, I would have been perfectly capable of killing her if I'd chosen to do so. Marcus appreciated the direct approach. But you didn't choose to? If I'd wanted Victoria dead, detective, she would have died years ago. Poison in her tea, a convenient fall down the stairs. There were countless opportunities. I wouldn't have waited until a house full of witnesses gathered to watch. Then why didn't you? Eleanor asked quietly. Isabel's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been vulnerability. Because she was the only connection I had left to my father. Harold adored her, and despite everything, she made his last years happy. Killing her would have dishonored his memory. Tell us about 1987, Marcus said. Watching her face carefully, unlike David, Isabel showed no obvious reaction. What about it? We found evidence suggesting that year holds significance for your stepmother. 1987 was when Victoria first came to work for my father's company. She was his secretary initially, before becoming his wife 2 years later. How did you feel about their relationship? I was 22 and convinced she was a fortune hunter. I did everything I could to prevent the marriage, including hiring a private investigator to dig into her background. Carter leaned forward. What did the investigator find? Nothing particularly damning. Victoria grew up poor, worked various jobs to support herself, had a brief marriage in her early 20s that ended in divorce. The usual struggles of someone from her background. You said nothing particularly damning? Marcus noted. That suggests something was found. Isabel hesitated for the first time since entering the room. There were some inconsistencies in her employment history, gaps that she couldn't fully explain. And there was mention of some kind of scandal at a previous job, but the investigator couldn't get specifics. Asterisk. What kind of scandal? Something involving missing funds and a man named Richard, though that might not be relevant. It was over 30 years ago. Eleanor's pen stopped, moving. Richard. Someone whose name started with her, like the mysterious correspondent. And Victoria's unfinished letter. Where were you between midnight and 6 this morning? Marcus asked. In my room, reading. I have chronic insomnia, so I was awake until nearly 4. I had my television on Losimol Movie Channel. Can anyone verify this? Unfortunately, no. But I can tell you that I heard footsteps in the corridor around 2 o'clock. Someone was moving around the house. Marcus's pulse quickened. Male or female footsteps? Impossible to tell. The corridors are carpeted, and whoever it was trying to move quietly. Which direction were they heading? Toward the east wing, where Victoria's study is located. The 3 investigators exchanged significant looks. If Isabel was telling the truth, someone had visited Victoria's study in the early morning hours, possibly around the time of her death. Why didn't you investigate the sounds? Carter asked. Isabel shrugged. Victoria often suffered from insomnia as well. I assumed she was wandering the house, as she sometimes did. Thank you. Miss Frost, please send in Mr. Pierce. Jonathan Pierce entered the library with the Miss. measured pace of a man accustomed to legal proceedings. At 62, he possessed the kind of distinguished bearing that inspired confidence in clients and judges alike. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive suit showed not a single wrinkle despite the day's stress. "Gentlemen, Miss Hayes," he nodded formally as he took his seat. "I must say that this entire investigation seems premature. Victoria died of natural causes. I fail to see why we're treating this as a potential homicide. Perhaps because someone wanted her dead badly, enough to ensure it happened," Marcus replied. "You've been the family attorney for how long?" 15 years, since shortly after Victoria married Harold Ashwood. I handled their wills, estate planning, various business matters, including the recent changes to Mrs. Ashwood's will. Pierce's professional mask remained firmly in place. "I'm bound by attorney-client privilege, Detective. I cannot discuss the specifics of Victoria's testamentary documents. She's dead, Mr. Pierce. Privilege typically dies with the client, not until the will is officially read and probated. Until then, I must maintain confidentiality." Eleanor tried a different approach. "Can you tell us about her state of mind regarding these changes?" Pierce considered this carefully. Victoria was determined. She'd made certain discoveries recently that influenced her decisions. She wanted to ensure that justice was done and that loyalty was properly rewarded. "What kind of discoveries?" "I'm not at liberty to say." Marcus felt his frustration mounting. Pierce was clearly holding back crucial information, but as long as he hid behind legal privilege, there was little they could do. "Tell me about last night," Marcus said. "Your conversation with David Ashwood? We discussed family matters. David was concerned about his financial situation and hoped Victoria might be willing to provide assistance. Did you encourage this hope?" "I told him that Victoria's decisions were her own to make, but you knew what those decisions were." Pierce's eyes flickered. "I knew what the will contained, yes. And David's prospects?" A long pause. "Let's simply say that Victoria valued loyalty above blood relations." Carter stepped forward. "Where were you between midnight and 6 this morning?" "In my room, reviewing some documents Victoria had asked me to examine. Legal papers dating back several decades." "What kind of papers?" "Employment records, financial statements, correspondence, the usual detritus that accumulates over a lifetime. Anything from 1987? For the first time, Pierce looked genuinely surprised. "How did you—" "Yes, actually. Victoria had been particularly interested in documents from that period." "What specifically?" "Personnel files from Ashwood Industries. She'd asked me to research several former employees, their dates of service, reasons for termination." Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. "Did any of these employees have names starting with R?" Pierce's composure finally cracked. "Detective, I really cannot ... A man is dead, Mr. Pierce, possibly murdered. Attorney-client privilege doesn't extend to obstruction of justice." After a long moment, Pierce nodded reluctantly. "There was a Richard Moreau. He worked for the company briefly in 1987 before being terminated under unfortunate circumstances." "What circumstances?" "Embezzlement. Though the charges were never filed, Victoria handled the matter internally. Why would Victoria be researching him now?" Pierce looked genuinely troubled. "I don't know, but she'd been asking questions about him for weeks. Wanted to know if he was still alive, where he might be living." She seemed quite agitated about the whole matter. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Victoria Ashwood had been investigating someone from her past, someone connected to a 36-year-old scandal. Someone who might have had reason to want her dead. "Mr. Pierce," Eleanor said quietly, "is Richard Moreau still alive?" "As far as I could determine, yes. He's been living under an assumed name in California, working as a bookkeeper for a small firm." "Under an assumed name?" Carter's interest sharpened. Why? After the embezzlement scandal, he found it difficult to find employment under his real name. Victoria's influence in business circles was considerable. Marcus stood and began pacing, his mind racing. A blackmailed embezzler, a mysterious chess piece, a torn photograph, and a house full of greedy relatives. The web was becoming more complex by the hour. One more question. Mr. Pierce, if someone wanted to gain access to Victoria's study last night, how might they have done so? The room locks from the inside, but there's a second key. Victoria kept it in her jewelry box for emergencies. Who would have known about this key? Pierce looked uncomfortable. Anyone who'd been in her bedroom, I suppose? The housekeeper, certainly. Dr. Marsh, who often checked on Victoria during the night. Possibly others? As Pierce left, Marcus turned to his companions. We're dealing with something far more complex than a simple inheritance dispute? Eleanor nodded. The question is whether Richard Moreau somehow found his way to Ashwood Manor, or if someone else is using his past connection to Victoria as a smokescreen. There's another possibility, Carter added grimly. What if Moreau never left the area? What if he's been hiding in plain sight all these years, waiting for his chance at revenge? Marcus stared out the window at the lengthening shadows. Night was falling over Ashwood Manor once again, and he had the distinct feeling that the killer's work was far from finished. The chess piece in Victoria's hand suddenly took on new meaning. In chess, the king was the most important piece, but also one of the weakest. Victoria had been playing a dangerous game with someone from her past. Now it was Marcus's turn to make a move. But first, he needed to speak with Dr. Helena Marsh, the woman who might hold the key to everything. Asterisk. Dr. Helena Marsh entered the library with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and devastating diagnoses. At 55, she carried herself with the poise of a woman who had spent decades earning respect in a male-dominated field. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled into a practical bun, and her dark eyes held the kind of compassion that came from years of healing others. Detective Blackwood, she said, settling gracefully into the chair. I must confess I'm quite disturbed by the suggestion that Victoria was murdered. In my professional opinion, her death appeared entirely consistent with cardiac arrest. Marcus studied her carefully. Unlike the other suspects, Dr. Marsh showed no obvious signs of nervousness or deception. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her breathing was steady, and she maintained direct eye contact. Tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Ashwood, he began. I became Victoria's physician 15 years ago, shortly after she married Harold. Initially, it was purely professional. She suffered from anxiety and mild hypertension. But over time, we developed a genuine friendship. That's unusual, isn't it? A doctor becoming so personally involved with a patient. Dr. Marsh's expression softened. Victoria was a lonely woman detective, wealthy beyond measure but starved for authentic human connection. Her family tolerated her for financial reasons, but few people actually cared about her as a person. Eleanor looked up from her notes. You cared about her? Very much. She reminded me of my own mother in many ways, brilliant, strong-willed, but deeply wounded by life's disappointments. What kind of wounds? Carter asked. Dr. Marsh hesitated, clearly weighing medical confidentiality against the needs of the investigation. Victoria never had children of her own. She'd suffered several miscarriages in her first marriage, and the doctors told her she'd never carry a pregnancy to term. It devastated her. Is that why she never had children with Harold Ashwood? Asterisk, partly yes. Though by then, she was in her late 40s and Harold already had Isabel. Victoria poured her maternal instincts into other pursuits, charity work. Mentoring young women in business, Marcus leaned forward. Including you? In a way. When I was struggling to establish my practice, Victoria provided both financial backing and referrals. She believed women should support each other in professional endeavors. That's quite generous. What did she expect in return? Loyalty, honesty. Victoria valued those qualities above all else, probably because they'd been so rare in her experience. Carter stepped closer. Dr. Marsh, what can you tell us about Victoria's mental state in recent weeks? The doctor's composure flickered slightly. She'd been agitated, more anxious than usual. She'd been having trouble sleeping and complained of feeling watched. Watched by whom? She never specified, but she'd taken to checking the locks on her windows multiple times each evening and insisted. I prescribed stronger sedatives. Eleanor's pen moved rapidly across her notebook. Did she mention any specific threats? Not directly, but she did make several references to past mistakes catching up with her. She seemed to believe someone from her earlier life might be seeking revenge. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Did she mention the name Richard Moreau? Dr. Marsh's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went pale, and her hands clenched involuntarily. How do you know that name? So you're familiar with Mr. Moreau? Victoria mentioned him recently. She'd been having nightmares about something that happened in 1987. She was convinced he'd found her. What happened in 1987? Dr. Marsh looked around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. Victoria told me she'd made a terrible mistake at her previous job. She'd discovered that someone was embezzling funds, but instead of reporting it immediately, she tried to handle it privately. Meaning? She confronted the person directly. Richard Moreau. But instead of getting a confession, she walked into what amounted to a trap. Carter leaned forward intently. What kind of trap? Moreau had doctored the evidence to make it appear that Victoria was the embezzler. When she confronted him, he threatened to present this false evidence to the authorities unless she agreed to keep quiet about his actual crimes. So she was being blackmailed? For a time, yes. But Victoria was smarter than Moreau realized. She secretly gathered evidence of his real crimes and eventually had him fired. However, she never pursued criminal charges, fearing that the scandal would damage her reputation and ruin her chances with Harold. Marcus absorbed this information, feeling another piece of the puzzle click into place. Did Victoria believe Moreau had returned to settle the score? She was convinced of it. Last week, she received an anonymous note with just 4 words. The game begins again. Eleanor looked up sharply. A game, like chess. Victoria thought so. She said Moreau had always fancied himself a chess master, always thinking several moves ahead. Dr. Marsh, Marcus said quietly, where is this note now? Victoria burned it. She said she didn't want any evidence of contact in case something happened to her. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Victoria had known she was in danger, yet she'd chosen to destroy potential evidence rather than seek police protection. Why didn't she contact the authorities? Carter asked, pride mostly. Victoria had spent decades building her reputation and social standing. The idea of having her past mistakes exposed, even as a victim of blackmail, was intolerable to her. Marcus stood and began pacing again. Dr. Marsh, I need you to think carefully. Did Victoria ever describe Richard Moreau physically? Any distinctive features or characteristics? She said he was unremarkable in appearance, average height, brown hair, the kind of man who could blend into any crowd. But she mentioned that he had a distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. What kind of scar? A crescent shape, apparently from broken glass. Victoria said it was quite noticeable when he wrote or gestured. Eleanor made a note of this detail. Have you noticed anyone with such a scar among the staff or visitors here? No, but then I haven't been specifically looking for it. Marcus returned to his chair. Tell me about last night. What was your impression of Victoria's mood during dinner? She seemed almost triumphant, as if she'd finally gained the upper hand in some long-running conflict. She kept making cryptic comments about justice and truth coming to light. Did you see her after dinner? Yes, briefly. Around 11 o'clock, I checked on her in her study. She was working on correspondence and seemed in good spirits. She thanked me for years of friendship and said I'd be happy with the changes she'd made to her will. Those were her exact words. Close enough. She also said something odd, that she'd finally found a way to turn the tables on someone who'd underestimated her. Carter frowned. What time did you last see her alive? That was it. 11 o'clock. I returned to my room and didn't see her again until ... Dr. Marsh's voice trailed off. Until what? Marcus prompted. This morning, when Mrs. Henley screamed. I was one of the first to reach Victoria's study. What was your immediate assessment? Cardiac arrest, as I mentioned. But there was something that bothered me. What? The positioning of her body. When people suffer heart attacks, they typically clutch their chest or throat instinctively. But Victoria's right hand was clenched around that chest piece, while her left hand was reaching towards something on the floor. Eleanor looked up sharply. What was on the floor? Nothing visible, but the carpet showed indentations, as if something small and round had been there recently. Marcus felt his excitement building. Like what? I couldn't say for certain, but if I had to guess, I'd say pills. The indentations were consistent with capsules or tablets. What kind of pills? That's what concerns me. Victoria's medication regimen was carefully controlled. If she'd taken something not prescribed, it could have triggered the cardiac episode. Carter stepped forward. Are you suggesting she was poisoned? I'm suggesting that someone with medical knowledge could have induced a heart attack using the right combination of drugs. It would appear natural to a cursory examination, but a thorough toxicology screen might reveal the truth. The three investigators exchanged meaningful glances. They were no longer dealing with a simple case of natural death. This was looking more and more like carefully planned murder. Dr. Marsh, Marcus said, who else in this house has medical knowledge? Asterisk, well, myself, obviously. Mrs. Henley has some nursing experience from her younger days, and ... yes. This might sound far-fetched, but Victoria mentioned that the new gardener seemed surprisingly knowledgeable about plants and their properties. She joked that he knew more about toxicology than most doctors. New gardener? Eleanor's pen stopped moving. When was he hired? About 3 weeks ago. Victoria was quite pleased with his work, said he had a real understanding of how to make things grow and how to make them die. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Where is this gardener now? I assume he's in his quarters above the carriage house. His name is Robert Morrison, though Victoria said he seemed oddly familiar when she first met him. Familiar how? She couldn't place where she might have known him from. Said it was probably nothing, just one of those faces that reminds you of someone else. But Marcus was already moving toward the door, his mind racing. Robert Morrison, R.M. Richard Moreau, had been living under an assumed name in California, according to Pierce. But what if he'd returned to the East Coast, taken a position at Ashwood Manor under yet another false identity? Inspector Carter, we need to speak with this gardener immediately. As they prepared to leave the library, Dr. Marsh called after them. Detective Blackwood, there's one more thing you should know. Marcus turned back. Yes, Victoria asked me to witness her signature on a document yesterday afternoon. A letter addressed to someone named Richard. She sealed it and asked me to ensure it was mailed if anything happened to her. Where is this letter now? In my medical bag. I was planning to take it to the post office this afternoon. We'll need to examine it immediately. Dr. Marsh retrieved a sealed envelope from her bag. The address was written in Victoria's distinctive handwriting. Richard Moreau, CO General Delivery, Sacramento, California. Marcus studied the envelope carefully. Did you read the contents? Of course not. That would have been a violation of Victoria's privacy. I'm afraid privacy concerns are secondary to murder investigations, Marcus replied, carefully opening the envelope. The letter was brief but devastating. Richard, by the time you read this, you'll know that your game has failed. I've always been 3 moves ahead of you, even when you thought you'd cornered my king. Asterisk, the evidence I gathered in 1987 is now in the hands of my attorney, along with proof of your current identity and location. You thought you could hide behind Robert Morrison, but I recognized you the moment you walked onto my property. You underestimated me then, and you've underestimated me now. Checkmate. Victoria Ashwood. Eleanor whistled softly. She knew. She knew exactly who he was and what he was planning. But if she knew, Carter said, why didn't she expose him immediately? Why play this dangerous game? Marcus refolded the letter carefully. Because Victoria Ashwood was a woman who valued control above all else. She wanted to defeat him on her own terms, to prove she was the superior player, asterisk, and it got her killed, Dr. Marsh said sadly. Perhaps. Or perhaps she had one final move that we haven't discovered yet. Marcus looked toward the window, where the carriage house was visible in the gathering dusk. Let's go meet Mr. Morrison, shall we? As they prepared to leave the manor, Mrs. Henley appeared in the hallway, wringing her hands nervously. The elderly housekeeper looked as if she'd aged a decade in the past. 24 hours, Detective Blackwood, she called. Might I have a word? Marcus paused. Of course, Mrs. Henley. What is it? It's about the gardener, sir, Mr. Morrison. I saw him this morning, just after we found Mrs. Ashwood. What about him? He was standing outside the kitchen window, watching all the commotion. But when he saw me looking at him, he disappeared. Haven't seen him since. Eleanor frowned. That was 8 hours ago. Where could he have gone? That's just it, miss. His truck is still parked behind the carriage house, and his clothes are still in his room. But he's nowhere to be found. Marcus felt a familiar tingle of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Richard Moreau or Robert Morrison had vanished. But Marcus had learned long ago that in cases like this, the killer rarely went far. He was still playing his game, and Victoria's death was only the opening move. Mrs. Henley, Marcus said, I want you to lock all the doors and windows. Don't let anyone in or out without Inspector Carter's explicit permission. You think he's still here, don't you? The housekeeper whispered. Marcus looked around at the shadows that seemed to be growing longer by the minute. Somewhere in or around Ashwood Manor, a killer was waiting to make his next move. I think, Marcus said quietly, that this game is far from over. As they prepared to search the carriage house, Eleanor noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the fading daylight, she could see a figure moving through the trees at the edge of the property. Someone was watching them, and whoever it was had been waiting for them to discover the truth about Richard. Moreau. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. Asterisk. The search of the carriage house revealed a hastily abandoned life. Robert Morrison's quarters above the old stable were sparse, but telling a few changes of work clothes, basic toiletries, and a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards that contained documents in the name of Richard. Moreau, driver's license, social security card, even a birth certificate, Carter muttered, examining the papers by flashlight. All legitimate-looking forgeries. Eleanor discovered something more disturbing in the small closet. A detailed map of Ashwood Manor with Victoria's study clearly marked, along with timing notations for the household's daily routines. He'd been planning this for weeks, but it was Marcus who found the most crucial piece of evidence, a notebook containing what appeared to be dosage calculations for various cardiac medications. The final entry, dated the previous day, showed a combination that would be lethal to someone with Victoria's medical history. Dr. Marsh was right, Marcus said grimly. This was carefully planned murder disguised as natural death. As they returned to the manor, the autumn wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the grounds. The figure Eleanor had spotted in the trees was gone, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling they were still being observed. He's not going to just disappear, Marcus told Carter as they entered the manor. Moreau has waited 36 years for this moment. Victoria's death was only part of his plan. What makes you think there's more? The chess piece. In chess, killing the opposing king ends the game, but Moreau left a black king in Victoria's hand. He was sending a message. Eleanor looked up from her notes. That he's the true king now, or that this particular game has just begun. Marcus paused in the foyer, his keen eyes taking in every shadow. Gather everyone in the drawing room. It's time to end this. Within minutes, the drawing room filled with the familiar cast of suspects, though the atmosphere was markedly different from their first meeting. Fear had replaced grief, suspicion had overtaken sorrow, and everyone seemed to be watching everyone else for signs of danger. David Ashwood paced nervously by the windows. This is ridiculous. If this Morrison fellow is the killer, why are we still being treated like suspects? Because, Marcus said, entering the room with Eleanor and Carter, Richard Moreau didn't act alone. The room fell deadly silent. Marcus positioned himself in front of the fireplace, his commanding presence immediately capturing everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed dealing with a carefully orchestrated murder. But the true genius of this crime lies not in its execution, but in its misdirection. Margaret Ashwood clutched her husband's arm. What do you mean? I mean that while we've been focused on Richard Moreau, a man who undoubtedly wanted Victoria dead, we've overlooked the possibility that someone else beat him to it. Dr. Marsh looked genuinely confused. But the evidence points directly to Morrison. The gardener who disappeared, the medical knowledge, the grudge from 1987, ... Indeed it does. Rather conveniently, wouldn't you say? Marcus began to pace, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a man revealing a complex truth. Consider the timeline. Moreau takes a position as gardener 3 weeks ago, clearly planning revenge against Victoria. He studies her routines, acquires the necessary drugs, prepares his attack. But on the very night he's ready to axe someone else, kills her first. Jonathan Pierce frowned. But seems incredibly coincidental. It would be if it were coincidental. Marcus fixed his gaze on each person in turn. But what if someone in this room knew about Moreau's presence and decided to use him as the perfect cover for their own crime? Isabel Frost spoke up from her chair near the window. How would anyone here know about Victoria's past with this Moreau person? An excellent question, Miss Frost. The answer lies in understanding who had access to Victoria's private papers, who could have discovered her correspondence with her. Attorney about researching Richard Moreau. Eleanor stepped forward with a manila folder. We found these in the library safe this afternoon, financial records, showing that someone had been systematically stealing small amounts from Victoria's accounts over the past 5 years. Never enough to trigger suspicion, but cumulatively amounting to over $200,000. David's face went white. That's impossible. All of Victoria's finances went through proper channels, ... through her personal physician, who had power of attorney for medical expenses. Marcus continued smoothly. Dr. Helena Marsh had unique access to Victoria's funds, ostensibly for medical treatments and equipment. But a detailed audit reveals numerous payments to fictional medical suppliers. All eyes turned to Dr. Marsh, who had gotten very still in her chair. This is absurd, she said quietly. I would never ... You cared for Victoria genuinely? Marcus said, his voice almost gentle. I believe that completely. But you also had enormous medical school debts, a struggling practice. and a lifestyle you couldn't maintain on your legitimate income. The embezzlement started small, just enough to cover expenses. But it grew, as these things always do. Dr. Marsh's composure was cracking. Even if that were true, which I'm not admitting, it doesn't make me a killer. No, but discovering that Richard Moreau was planning to murder your golden goose certainly provided motive for acceleration. Marcus turned to face her directly. You realize that if Moreau succeeded in killing Victoria, all your financial problems would be solved. Her death would end any possibility of discovery, and you'd likely inherit substantially as her close friend and medical advisor. But if Moreau killed her, Eleanor added, you'd have no control over the timing or method. So you decided to kill her yourself and frame Moreau for the crime. Carter stepped closer to Dr. Marsh. That's why you were so quick to suggest natural causes this morning. You wanted to avoid an autopsy that might reveal the truth. This is all speculation, Dr. Marsh said, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus shook his head. Dr. Marsh, when you visited Victoria in her study at 11 o'clock last night, you didn't just check on her welfare. You administered a carefully calculated dose of cardiac medication, enough to trigger a massive heart attack in someone with her medical history. Asterisk. You can't prove that. Actually, we can. Eleanor opened her notebook. You made one crucial mistake. When you described finding Victoria's body this morning, you mentioned that her left hand was reaching toward something on the floor pills that had been dropped. But according to Mrs. Hemley's statement, you didn't enter the study until after she unlocked the door and called for help. You couldn't have seen the positioning of the body from the doorway. Dr. Marsh's face had gone ashen. I was trying to help establish cause of death, ... You were trying to explain away evidence of your crime, Marcus said firmly. The pills Victoria was reaching for weren't medication, they were evidence. You dropped the syringe you used to inject her, and when she realized what was happening, she tried to reach the hidden recording device she'd placed under her desk. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Recording device? Pierce asked. Asterisk. Victoria suspected someone was stealing from her, though she thought it was one of her relatives. She'd been recording conversations in her study for weeks, hoping to catch the thief. Last night's recording captured everything, including Dr. Marsh's confession of embezzlement and her admission that she couldn't let Victoria live to expose her. Dr. Marsh stood abruptly, her professional facade finally crumbling completely. She was going to destroy me. 20 years of medical practice gone because of a few financial irregularities. I gave that woman my friendship, my devotion, my professional reputation, and she was going to throw me away like garbage. So you killed her, Carter said, moving to block the door. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I went to her study to confess, to beg for her forgiveness, and promise to repay everything. But she was so cold, so clinical. She said I'd betrayed her trust and that she could never allow me to continue practicing medicine. Margaret Ashwood looked horrified. So you murdered her? I panicked. I had the syringe with me. I'd been treating her for anxiety, and she often needed injections during her attacks. It was so easy to increase the dosage to trigger the cardiac episode. She trusted me completely. Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of a case concluded, tempered by sadness for the waste of 2 lives. And the chess piece? I found it in her desk drawer while I was staging the scene. I thought it would confuse the investigation, make you focus on games and puzzles instead of medical evidence. What about Morse and Moreau? Dr. Marsh laughed bitterly. Pure luck. I had no idea he existed until this morning when you started asking about mysterious gardeners. When I realized you'd connected him to Victoria's past, I decided to let him take the blame. Eleanor frowned. But he did disappear. Where is he now? Probably halfway to Canada by now. When he realized Victoria was dead and the police were investigating, he must have panicked and run. He never got the chance to implement his own revenge plot. Carter approached Dr. Marsh with handcuffs. "Dr. Helena Marsh, you're under arrest for the murder of Victoria Ashwood." As Carter read her rights, Dr. Marsh looked around the room with something approaching regret. "I want you all to know I did care about Victoria. She was the closest thing to a mother I'd ever had. But I couldn't let her destroy my life over money. Money you stole from her," Isabel said coldly. "Money she'd never miss. She had millions, I took thousands. It was supposed to be temporary, just until my practice stabilized. But Marcus was no longer listening. He was thinking about Victoria Ashwood, a lonely woman who had died at the hands of someone she trusted completely. The chess piece had been meaningful after all, not as a clue to Richard Moreau's involvement, but as a symbol of Victoria's final game. She had suspected betrayal, but never imagined it would come from the person she considered a daughter. As Dr. Marsh was led away, the remaining family members sat in stunned silence. David was the first to speak. "So what happens now?" "To the estate, Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. "The will reading is tomorrow morning. Victoria's wishes will be carried out regardless of these tragic circumstances." Marcus gathered his coat and signaled to Eleanor. Their work here was finished, but he found himself hoping that Victoria's final wishes would reflect the loyalty and love she'd been seeking all her life. "Detective Blackwood," Margaret called as they prepared to leave. "Thank you. If you hadn't uncovered the truth, Dr. Marsh would have inherited substantially and gotten away with both embezzlement and murder," Marcus finished. "Justice has been served, Mrs. Ashwood. That's all any of us can hope for." As they drove away from Ashwood Manor, Eleanor was quiet for several miles before finally speaking. "It's sad, really. Victoria finally found someone she thought truly cared about her, and it was all based on greed." Marcus nodded, watching the manor disappear in the rearview mirror. "The most dangerous killers are often those we trust completely. They have the perfect access, the perfect cover, and the perfect motive, our own blind faith in their good intentions." "What about Richard Moreau? Will they find him?" "Eventually, perhaps. Though I suspect Victoria's death robbed him of the satisfaction he'd been seeking for 36 years. Sometimes the greatest revenge is letting someone else destroy what you hope to destroy yourself." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Another case closed, indeed. Though I have a feeling the true winner of this particular game was Victoria herself. Something tells me her will is going to contain a few surprises that might have made even this tragedy worthwhile." As they drove into the night, Marcus reflected on the complex web of relationships, lies, and betrayals that have led to murder at Ashwood Manor. Chess piece Victoria had been found clutching wasn't a clue, it was a message. In her final moments, she had understood that she had been outplayed not by an old enemy, but by someone she had trusted completely. But in death, Victoria Ashwood would have the last move after all. Justice, as she had written her final letter, had indeed been served.